Welcome to this week's edition of Focus on Connecticut. I'm Tom Appleby. We've been talking a lot about the budget over the last few weeks for the state of Connecticut. This week we're going to talk about what the Judiciary Committee is considering. Often the most interesting issues come up before this committee. Let me introduce our guests to you. They are State Representative Bruce Morris, who is a Democrat with the 140th District, that's Norwalk, and State Representative Tom O'Day, Republican with the 125th District, that's New Canaan and Wilton. Gentlemen, thank you.
Good morning.
Thank you, Tom. Great to be with you.
And I understand, Mr. O'Day, you announced last night that you're running again.
I am going to run for re-election. I met with my family and my partners at DeSero Martin and decided to run again. So, good.
Likewise, yes.
Very good.
We'll be running
then
again.
We'll probably be seeing you here for the debates coming in the fall. Right now, let's debate some of these issues. The most serious facing the judiciary in our state right now is the cut they're being asked to make, at least proposed by the governor. It's a $64 million cut. They're saying it's disproportionate to any other department. It's 11.2% of Malloy's proposed cuts. And they're saying if we have to do that, the system is going to be severely compromised, to the point where maybe more than 1,000 people will have to be let go. Courthouses will have to close. A youth training facility, I believe, will have to go. So what's your take on what the state should be doing?
Well, I need to get a little bit more information, number one. I do know that some of those cuts are related to some of the plans that they have through the juvenile justice, JPOC. That makes a lot of recommendations for raise the age legislation. And certainly closing down CJTS is one of those things that they're looking towards doing. But those are good measures. If we can actually do better by our kids, our youth, and keep them safe, keep the public safe, I could go for that. But I'm concerned, again, I have to look at it because there's a number of measures of juvenile, not just juvenile, even judicial measures that we as a state have taken proactively. That some of them have costs associated with them, even for youth, where we're providing mental health and other things, similar to our second chance legislation last year, treating drug addiction no longer as a crime but as a health issue. That is supposed to save us money on the judicial side. So I just need to see whether that is a connection or not.
Well, they're actually saying that the Second Chance Society will be impacted by these cuts.
And if that's the case, I can't support that. We need to look. We're gonna have a hard time. We know that. But I think we need to continue to be forward thinking. There are some things that have been in our budget for decades that have cost us money, hurt families, that have hurt our human capital, our ability to have good people working great jobs, and there's a cost associated with that. There's a time in which you need to make those investments while you're transitioning from hyper incarceration to providing community services. There's a cost. We're just at a very tough time, so we need to take a look at it. The governor wants to get a lot done before the end of the session. I don't know how realistic that's going to be because we need to really evaluate what we're doing for the long term.
Look, we're going to have to look at cuts across the board, not just at the judiciary. So my problem with what I've heard so far about the proposal is that it's disproportionate as to other areas of the state government. The judiciary has done a very good job of passing and implementing new laws and policies and practices with regard to helping out with GALs. We passed legislation last term with GALs. Family services have stepped up what they do in getting involved in families that are going through a difficult time. And if we cut the judiciary this dramatically, disproportionate to what we're cutting in other parts of the budget, it's going to have a very bad impact on the services that impact our most needy at this point in time. So, I have been saying, when I first ran for this number of years ago, this position as state rep, my position was we had to cut spending 4 years ago by 10% across the board to avoid where we are now. And I think focusing in on and cutting judiciary more than we're cutting other parts of the budget, I think is unfair. Obviously, we're going to look at where we can cut fairly dramatically, but I think this is going to have a disproportionate impact on those most needy.
State Representative O'Neill, who was on this program last week, said there may even be some constitutional questions about these cuts, whether you can go ahead and do them because of the impact.
And again, I need to get down into the weeds on it, and haven't had the opportunity to do that yet.
Going to take a break. Let's get down into the weeds and talk about probate court fees when we come back. Stay with us. Welcome back. We're talking with two members of the Judiciary Committee who are actively discussing the issues during the break, as a matter of fact. During the last session, the legislature eliminated the cap on probate court fees. It was $12,500. It could have, by removing it, it could go as high as $1 million. So there is a movement afoot now, proposal to reinstate that cap. Are you for it?
Absolutely. So I was vehemently opposed to eliminating the cap, because what we've seen is our the most wealthy and our retirees want to leave because the taxes have become disproportionate to our retirees. So by what we're telling those that are living here in their later years in life, you better not die in Connecticut because the taxes are going to be the worst, one of the worst in the country. So by putting this cap back, we're encouraging those who have lived in Connecticut to stay in Connecticut and spend their later years here. So I'm very much in favor of putting the cap back.
Was it removed so that we could get more income for the state?
I don't know what the rationale was for it, but I agree that it needs to be there. Because I've always had some concern about probate court reform. And what happens there, what those costs are. It's not even just as it deals with the states. There's just other costs, even with the GALs that we've had to rein in. That you're killing people's estates. So,
yeah, I was just going to mention too. Unfortunately, what's happened, we're requiring the probate courts to fund themselves. It used to be years ago the probate courts were giving surpluses to the state, but then we acted reform so that we limited staffing. We tried to consolidate, and we started eliminating some of the fees they could charge, which is generally a good thing. But what's happened is the probate courts, because of all the regulations that we put in place on them, they're no longer giving money to the state. Now that we've limited things so much that they can't fund themselves, and we shouldn't require them to fund themselves. At the end of the day, we're putting them in a position where they're going to, and now we're going to put back the cap, which we all agree we should do. We shouldn't then again require them to fund themselves.
Right. Also, probate related, property and probate related, transfer on death deed. This is something that's being proposed, in which I guess a parent can leave, or anyone I suppose, can leave a house, the deed to a house, or even a vehicle, in such a position that when they pass away, it doesn't go through probate, and so taxes are not paid on that. Do I have that explained accurately?
Yes, you do. And look, it again is a vehicle to help those who are doing their estate planning to try and transfer their assets without it being taxed.
Right.
So it again encourages our seniors to stay in Connecticut to make it a more friendly place for seniors.
yeah. And now I would think even those who are wealthy, as they're the transference of wealth to those who are going to inherit. I would want to keep someone in the state who's elderly, and their next generation be able to transfer their wealth here, so they would stay here rather than them taking it out, selling it, leaving, and going somewhere else. The likelihood is that their heirs are going to be quality residents of the state of Connecticut and want to continue the future viability of our state.
On the other hand, this will be a loss of income for the state.
To a certain extent, but you look, the tax on Social Security right now is a revenue generator of only about 25 million. Now I say only 25 million. We've got a much larger budget, but look at the revenue we keep if we get rid of that tax and we encourage more people to stay in the state of Connecticut. I assure you, whatever we lose in that tax will be gained by encouraging more seniors to stay here.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back and talk about revenue, there is a proposal to legalize the recreational use of marijuana, and there are those who say that could bring in $50 million to the state's coffers. We'll talk about it right after this. Welcome back to Focus on Connecticut. I'm Tom Appleby. Our guests are two members of the Judiciary Committee from both members of the State House of Representatives. Tom O'Day is a Republican with the 125th District, and Bruce Morris is a Democrat with the 140th District. So, marijuana. Right now, we do allow medical marijuana. Palliative, I think, is the term you use. But now there's this proposal to follow the lead of some states, like Colorado, which is bringing in, I think they have something like 5 million people, and they're bringing in about $100 million in taxes. Connecticut, with $3.5 million, the estimate is maybe in the range of $50 million. Is that a good way to spend money? Earn money, sorry.
I will tell you, we just had a regulation review committee meeting about expanding medical marijuana just last week. And I will say I learned a lot at that committee meeting. And that's a bipartisan committee that looked at the expansion of the medical marijuana, palliative marijuana. And look, the legislation we passed a number of years ago set up a board of physicians that's supposed to, of experts in palliative marijuana, that's supposed to look at, the studies and decide whether or not it's a good idea to even expand the medical marijuana.
And when you say expanding, other illnesses can be...
Yeah. Exactly. Excuse me. Yes. So right now, the epileptic seizures is clearly something that has worked, and one of the concepts too was that we've got an opiate problem going on through the United States, and is this a way to try and steer people away from the opiates if you can use the medical marijuana? I voted against it, but now we have it. So in looking at it. One of the problems is our Board of Physicians only had 4 members on the board to take a look at the palliative marijuana. So we've got to get that fully staffed, and they're looking to do that. Commissioner Harris was in front of us and did a very good job of articulating what the process is in looking at it and getting the physicians to review it. But we're not there yet. We don't even have a full staff of physicians looking at whether or not we can expand the medical marijuana, the groups of diseases that can be treated with it. Before we even legalize, you got to look at what's going on in Colorado. They've got a situation where, yes, they have some revenues coming in, but they also have people heading to Colorado to use the medical marijuana or the recreational use marijuana who are a drain on the system. They're not paying taxes. They're just going to Colorado, living off of the state subsistence, and it's creating a very bad problem in Colorado right now. So, I'm very much opposed to allowing recreational use of marijuana, and I did vote against extending the medical treatment of certain diseases, but until we get more studies. You could use marijuana in oil form. You could take out the THC, which is the hallucinogenic, the part of it that makes you high. I don't mean to go on this, but back in the 70s and 80s, the THC content was 1%, 2%, 3% in the marijuana that was being used. Now it's the synthetic, it's 11%, 12%, and it's causing a lot of problems. So take out the THC or limit it to 1% and see what the results are in studies on the certain problems that people are going through before we decide to use it recreationally.
Tom, I would say we do have a drug problem in this country and in the state. I mean, we're talking about marijuana right now, but you're talking about opioids. I mean, the reality is, fortunately, we're now treating all drug problems as a health issue. Good thing we are, because suburban America, suburban Connecticut right now has a real problem with heroin. All right, whether people want to consider marijuana a gateway drug or not, I do. We decriminalized. We did a lot of things that really had me very concerned about the overuse of drugs and the message that we have sent to kids. I work for a school system as well, and I can tell you, I do the expulsion hearings. The number of kids we have and hearings that we have to do for kids with drugs is concerning. And a lot of this is because of some of the changes. So we certainly need to deal with it as a health issue, but if we make marijuana recreational, and we have kids that start doing that earlier in age, and then the likelihood that we may end up having them, these same kids using heroin, because a lot of young kids, teenagers in suburban America are using heroin, and that's why doctors are becoming alarmed, because we're having to use the drugs to save their lives. So I do not think that Connecticut is prepared for that. I don't think it's good for the nation. I think it'll continue to raise our healthcare costs. I think in the long term it'll end up raising our costs we have for mental health. Just for teens alone, we do not have enough mental health services available for kids, even for adults. We do not have it. So I think it's a bad thing. And just as the information you're given in terms of those who are racing to Colorado and the net effect that it's having on their system, we don't need that here in the state of Connecticut.
One more break. When we come back, let's talk about some measures being proposed in the realm of human trafficking. We'll talk about that when we come back. Can you wait? Okay, thanks. Take a look.
Prostitution is
Guilty of enticing a minor when you use a computer. Guilty of trafficking in people when a person compels or induces another person to engage in conduct involving more than one occurrence of sexual contact with one or more third persons. I mean, this is all basic stuff. Trafficking in persons is a Class B felony. So I'm not clear on whether they're upping the penalties.
A lot of it has to do with young kids, though. When I looked at my overview, a lot has to do with youth, especially like those are 16 or under.
Yes.
Before you said, I didn't know that she was that young. No, you can hold guilty regardless. It's that kind of thing. So it's really protecting youth more than anything else.
All right. Then so we don't have to spend a lot of time and drill down to your expertise or lack thereof. It will. We'll move on.
Human trafficking is an issue. We need to.
Okay. Just a few minutes left with our guests. The concept of human trafficking, and it talks. It could be adults, it could be children, who are used against their will for sexual purposes. That's, I guess, the general definition. And the state is looking to firm up its rules about this. Are we doing a good job?
Well, that's the purpose for the law. We still have a number of young kids, and mind you, at least of most of the measures that are in the law right now are up in the ante and making certain that adults are certainly held more responsible in terms of their sexual activity with those who are underage. And that's a good thing. Across the country, and certainly I would say Connecticut is no different. When you have major sporting events and things like that, you find that there are teenagers that are transported all over the country and used for sexually exploited. So good thing, something we need to do.
I mean, look, anything to tighten our laws on eliminating the sexual predators who are going online and getting a 14-year-old to meet them somewhere. I just saw, I think it was in Missouri, where two boys had lured a 14-year-old, two men had lured a 14-year-old, and they ended up murdering her. Look, anything we can do to help eliminate that and limit human trafficking is something I would support, and I know all my colleagues would support. And my understanding is this bill will make it broaden the scope of the law so that if you're simply fishing and going online to trying to lure someone, that actually now is part of a crime, a criminal event. So I think you'll find bipartisan support for anything like that.
Oh yeah, and the disclaimer, well, I didn't know that he or she was this age. No, you'll be held responsible. So there's going to be a greater responsibility for adults to make certain they know the age of someone who they're engaging in sexual activity.
Talking about responsibility, this is a bizarre segue from human trafficking to something a little more mundane, but it's particularly appropriate this week when we've seen so many power outages because of trees and limbs that are down. There is a bill proposed to assign responsibility for a tree that has come down on a neighbor's property to the neighbor who owns the tree in certain circumstances.
I think it makes sense. The problem is, so the law requires a neighbor. So if a neighbor notifies you that, look, I've got this arborist, here's the letter from the arborist, and he says that, or she says that tree is going to come down within the next 5 years, you need to take care of it, and they don't, and it ultimately falls on your property, then that person is responsible. It makes sense. Representative Camillo's been pushing that for a number of years.
So currently, if your tree falls on my property, it's my problem.
Correct. Unless you give notice, and this law kind of puts in place the notice requirements and to shift the liability over to your neighbor.
Seems common sense legislation to me.
I mean, look, right now, neighbors are doing this without the law.
Right.
Unfortunately, we do create laws for neighbors that don't cooperate. So I think basically this is one of
You mean
one of those
neighbors are working together?
Yes, exactly.
And this issue does come up. I mean, I've got constituents, I receive letters all the time since I've been on Judiciary. Every now and then this has come up as an issue where the neighbor isn't willing to pay and the person is stuck with the bill. And sometimes it is a person who does not have the ability to pay. And it was their neighbor's tree. So we need to clearly define it.
And look, there's a catch-22 in all this, right? So with the electricity problems that we've had in this latest storm, kind of caught us by surprise, but the problems were a lot less than they would have been a number of years ago because of the companies cutting back the trees. And then we had constituents complaining they were cutting back too much, but we saw with this latest storm that less people lost their power because of that program of cutting the trees back. 2
minutes left. You were outspoken this week on a proposal to enable ex-felons to apply and interview for a job without having to check the box, without having to say, I am an ex-felon up front.
Great, yeah. Leveling the playing field. Right now, we already have that law in place. I think we did it in 2012 Assembly. As state of Connecticut, you do not have to check the box.
You're talking if you apply for a state job.
If you apply for a state job. So this is now making that the same standard there apply in private sector. So a person, it's not that you have to hire the person, but you can't ask that question until after they've gone through the entire interview process and you've given them a conditional offer of employment. Once you've done that, then you can do the background checks, and if it comes back and it's something that is really serious, certainly if someone has to work with kids and he shouldn't be doing that, or money, but the employer will be required though to consider the age of the person was when they had the crime and how long that period has been.
Mm-hmm. But the employer, would the employer then be liable?
No,
the applicant could not sue the employer after having gone through this whole process and having said I'm a felon, and then they don't get the job.
The employer is allowed to still hire people based on their qualifications. This is just really giving you an opportunity to sell yourself.
When I first heard the proposal, I was leaning against, but Representative Morris and we were talking before the show about it, and on one level it does make sense to try, and if it's a very old crime and one that wouldn't impact them currently, in your opinion, I may lean towards looking at it and voting for it, depending on what liability an employer would have going forward. That would concern me. Look, we need to grow jobs in Connecticut and make it easier for employers.
I'm going to lose mine if I don't.
And we need to keep investing in our human
Gentlemen,
capital.
thank you for coming by. I appreciate it. Thank you for watching. Please stay tuned. The news continues.